The clock of the Tuileries began striking the final quarter before midnight, when a mud-spattered carriage swung onto the parade ground in front of the palace. Inside sat a plump man in a fur bonnet, the Emperor Napoleon, racing back to his capital in secret to reassert his authority. Behind him, he had left the remnants of a fine army struggling through the snows of Russia, where over 500,000 men had already perished. For nearly 20 years, Europe had been locked in a state of constant gore-spattered conflict. Before this disastrous retreat, Napoleon had been the undisputed master of the continent, wielding more power than any Roman emperor. He had systematically dismantled the old order, dissolving the thousand-year-old Holy Roman Empire and redrawing every border to suit his interests. The spirit of usurpation replaced ancient dynasties with a new system of imperial dependencies across Germany, Italy, and Poland. The continent was now physically and morally exhausted. The legacy of the French Revolution had introduced dangerous new ideas of nationalism and liberalism that terrified the old monarchies. The execution of the French king, years prior, had insulted the status of kingship, and the rising concept of sovereignty of the people threatened to undermine the paternal absolute rule of every remaining house. Statesmen like Metternich viewed the revolution as a catastrophe that had destroyed the natural order of the established religion and hierarchy. By the spring of 1813, the prevailing feeling among all nations was a desperate desire for repose. Europe had become a vast, beautiful madhouse where no peace could be considered final. The old aristocratic world was gone, and in its place was a sense of profound insecurity that made a general congress of powers an urgent necessity. Leaders across the continent realized that if they did not gather to reconstruct the balance of power, the entire social and political fabric of the world might perish. As Napoleon's shadow receded, a vast political void opened across the continent. Count Clemens von Metternich stepped forward to fill this silence as the ultimate political puppeteer. He was a man deeply rooted in traditions of the old world, believing that the natural order of established hierarchy was the only cure for chaos. Alongside him was Tsar Alexander I, a ruler who appeared to many as the very bio-ideal of monarchy. Alexander was increasingly convinced that he possessed a divine calling to save the world from Napoleon's legacy of destruction. Britain sent Viscount Castlereagh, an immensely likable man who sought to anchor the peace in pragmatic stability. Although he was a thoroughly decent person, he proved himself ready to trade souls and cut up nations to ensure a firm balance of power. King Frederick William III of Prussia played a more desperate hand, driven by a deep sense of past failure and an innate suspicion. He clung to the remains of his realm, looking for any opportunistic gain that might restore the status Prussia had lost during its years of humiliation. Then there was Vulpine Talleyrand, the disgraced former bishop who had served Napoleon only to meticulously plot his downfall. He weaved through the gilded boudoirs of the high and mighty, playing every side to ensure that France survived the wreckage of the empire. These men were doing more than simply drawing lines on maps. They were engaged in a great carnival of royalty, a grand performance of courtly elegance and waltzing frivolity. The Congress was a deliberate theater designed to prove to a skeptical world that absolute monarchy was still the only legitimate way to govern mankind. The call to assemble finally echoed across the continent, promising that in the city of Vienna, the masters of the world would at last decide the future of the human race. This summons sparked a massive migration of humanity, drawing a staggering numbers of visitors and delegations into the Austrian capital. By September, the city's population of 250,000 was being overwhelmed by a flood of 16,000 new arrivals in that single month. This was not merely a meeting of diplomats, it was the greatest gathering of royalty and the largest aristocratic assembly history had ever witnessed. Beyond the emperors and kings, the streets were choked with representatives from every republic, city-state and corporation, alongside actors, card sharps and petitioners seeking to reclaim lost lands or ancient rights. Vienna became an overflowing hive of activity, where every spare room, garret and even dark closet was spruced up to accommodate the elite of Europe at exorbitant prices. Dark green carriages bearing the Habsburg arms rattled through the cobblestones while over 1,000 white horses stood ready to serve the whims of the visiting monarchs. Every tailor and paper hanger in the city was swept up in a frenzy of preparation, as a vast audience gathered to watch the world being rebuilt behind gilded doors. It was the start of the greatest diplomatic contest of all time. A performance of power played out before an exhausted and expectant Europe. Vienna transformed into the political epicenter of the continent, a stage crowded with thousands who came to watch the masters of the world. Beneath the surface of courtly elegance, a vast machine of surveillance hummed as Baron Hager deployed a small army of spies to watch every royal move. No detail was too small for the Austrian secret police, who recruited servants to eavesdrop behind closed doors and copy every letter pulled from a diplomat's desk. Even the intimate correspondence of the monarchs and the contents of their laundry were scrutinized by official searchings for clues to their true intentions. As said earlier, this was a carnival of royalty, where history took a holiday, and the fate of nations was decided between the terms of a waltz or even a 36-course dinners. The Congress never functioned as a formal assembly. Instead, it operated as a social whirlwind, where the real work happened in gilded boudoirs and the back seats of carriages. While the Big Four powers huddled in secret conferences to carve up Europe like a piece of cheese, representatives of smaller nations were left to languish in the antechambers. Hundreds of delegates from minor principalities and extinguished republics waited for months, growing bitter and broke as they realized they were merely spectators in a game played by the strong. Metternich himself acted as the supreme stage manager, choreographing every ball and hunting party to project an image of absolute stability. In this beautiful madhouse, the rattling of sabers was often drowned out by the clatter of silver plates, and the laughter of beautiful women, who were every bit as influential as the diplomats. At the ungodly hour of 6 o'clock on the morning of March 7, 1815, at the ungodly hour of 6 o'clock in the morning of the 7th of March, 1815, Metternich's valet, Giroux, shook his master awake with an urgent dispatch from the Consulate General in Genoa. Within that envelope was a brief, terrifying note. The English commissioner had sailed into the harbor of Elba, only to discover that Napoleon had vanished. Metternich sprang from his bed, and by 8 o'clock he was standing at the door of the Empress Frances' bedroom, delivering the news that the man who had disturbed the world for so many years had returned. The tidings ignited a wildfire of confusion and dread across Vienna. Sovereigns and ministers attempted to maintain a facade of calm, but the mask of courtly elegance slipped. The King of Bavaria reportedly lost his appetite from sheer fear, while the Tsar was visibly shaken. Austrian paper money plummeted in value in a single week, as rumors swirled that the ogre had already reached the heart of France. Many feared the Congress was over before it could even sign its final act, as Napoleon's resumption of power appeared seamless and his old guard surged back to his side. Yet this crisis performed a miracle that months of waltzing could not. It instantly reunified the squabbling allies. The bitter contests over Polish borders and German fortresses were set aside, as the powers realized they were once again facing a common nemesis. On the 13th of March, 6 days later, they issued a joint declaration branding Napoleon an outlaw and a pariah, effectively stripping him of any legal right to rule or even exist under international law. The contest reached its climax on the bloody, rain-soaked fields of Waterloo on June the 18th, 1815. Napoleon staked his entire future on a quick victory, but the combined weight of Wellington's defense and Blücher's Prussian arrival delivered a mortal blow to the Grande Army. While the Congress had been on the verge of collapsing into eternal conflict, this final victory saved the assembly and gifted the victors a total, unencumbered hand to redraw the map of Europe. Napoleon was sent into the silence of the South Atlantic, and the masses of the world returned to their tables, now certain that they alone would dictate the rules for the next century. The air in the conference rooms grew thick with a new tension, as Tsar Alexander I made his ultimate demand. He wanted the whole of Poland. Alexander believed he possessed a divine calling to resurrect the Polish nation, yet he intended to do so with himself wearing the crown. The vision sent a shiver through the Austrian and Prussian delegations, who saw a Russian giant looming ever further into the heart of the continent. At one point, the most contentious issue of the entire gathering brought the powers to the very brink of a new war. The Tsar's tone turned menacing as he reminded his colleagues that he had 200,000 soldiers currently occupying the territory. He famously declared that he would rather have war than relinquish his hold on the lands his bayonets had already secured. Eventually, the exhausted diplomats reached a fragile compromise, birthing a semi-autonomous conquest kingdom of Poland that remained inseparably bound to the Russian Empire. As the Polish map was being redrawn, Prussia launched his own desperate gamble by demanding the annexation of the entire kingdom of Saxony. The Prussian ministers argued that their state needed a strong, solid center to survive, seeing Saxony as their just prize for the blood spilled at the Battle of the Nations. This grab for power horrified the other delegates, as states like Britain and Austria feared a Prussian hegemony in the north. Diplomats began a clinical and cold calculation of souls, treating the inhabitants of ancient cities as a simple mathematical currency. Human lives were traded like horses at the market, with little regard for the history or identity of the people being shifted across new borders. After months of bitter haggling and backroom deals, a mutilated Saxony survived, though half of its territory was signed away to satisfy the Prussian hunger for expansion. Behind the waltzes and the wine, three heavy principles anchored the negotiations. The first was legitimacy, a concept the Philippine Talleyrand wielded with surgical precision. He argued that the only way to banish the chaos of Napoleon's usurpation was to bring back the rightful ancient dynasties. Most importantly, the Bourbons in France. Metternich agreed with this sentiment, as he was convinced that a natural order of established religion and hierarchy was the only barrier against revolutionary madness. Then came the balance of power, a clinical calculation designed to ensure no single nation could ever terrorize the continent again. For Castlereagh and Metternich, this meant turning Central Europe into a stable bloc that could check the expansionist urges of both France in the west and the rising Russian giant in the east. Every border was drawn to create a system where mutual fear kept the peace, forcing powers to accept the vital interests of their neighbors. The third pillar was compensation, the engine that drove the clinical trading of human lives. Because the winners had lost so much during the long years of war, they demanded equivalents, new lands to make up for those they had surrendered elsewhere. If Russia kept Poland, then Prussia had to be paid with Saxony, and Austria had to be fed with the rich cities of northern Italy. These weren't just ideas, they were tools to justify whatever the Big Four wanted. Legitimacy was invoked when it suited the masters of the world, but they ignored it when they wanted to keep a piece of land stolen. The balance of power became a game of poker where the cards were the souls of millions, bundled into units traded across the table like market cattle. In this grand reconstruction, the interests of the people were forgotten, and only the hunger of the great powers remained. The waltz finally slowed as the ink on the final act dried, revealing a map of Europe that the victors hoped would endure for generations. France, though initially treated with leniency, faced a sterner judgment after the 100 Days, and saw its borders shrunken back to the limits of 1790. The Allies designed these boundaries to ensure that the nation remained a significant power while removing the conquests once used to dominate the continent. To the north, a new United Kingdom of the Netherlands was forged, uniting Holland and Belgium into a single kingdom to act as a counter to French ambitions. This bastion was a linchpin of a broader strategy, to serve as a permanent military barrier against any future French expansion toward the sea. In the center of the continent, the bewildering mosaic of hundreds of small German states was reduced to a German confederation of 38 sovereign units. This Bund was dominated by Austria, which held the permanent presidency of the Federal Diet in Frankfurt. Prussia emerged as a renewed power by trading its old Polish lands for a massive windfall in the west, including the Rhine provinces and Westphalia. This move turned Prussia into a sentinel of Germany, standing guard directly on the French frontier. The Tsar of Russia secured the Congress Kingdom of Poland, a semi-autonomous state that remained inseparably bound to the Russian Empire. Austria consolidated its own empire by relinquishing its distant northern possessions to focus on the wealth of Italy. The Habsburgs secured a firm grip over the peninsula, taking direct possession of Lombardy, Venetia, and exerting influence over a surrounding patchwork of minor kingdoms. The ink was barely dry on the final act when the victors forged a new, more permanent bond, known as a quadruple alliance, a pact that gave birth to the Congress system. This was a radical departure from the past, an agreement to hold regular meetings between the masters of the world to review the state of the continent and smother any spark of war before it could ignite. It functioned as an excessive club for the great powers, a mechanism designed to ensure that the strongest remained the sole arbiters of human affairs. These men gradually turned their new order into a formidable engine of repression, viewing any call for liberty as a contagious disease that must be eradicated. At meetings in places like Troppau, they even developed protocols that granted themselves the right to intervene in the internal business of any nation where revolution threatened the status quo. It was, in truth, the first time in history that a group of states attempted to build a rules-based international order. Yet these rules were etched into the map by the powerful. The system of collective policing eventually silenced the aspirations of entire nations, forcing the people into a repressed, clandestine existence. The reality of this new era was often turbulent, marked by a succession of bloody revolts and local wars across the decades. The habit of consultation between nations survived the immediate collapse of the alliance, becoming a permanent fixture of global diplomacy. The spirit of Vienna created a simulacrum of stability that held the world together through a shared sense of responsibility and mutual fear, until the entire structure finally disintegrated in the cataclysm of 1914. The Congress left a lasting mark on the human race by pioneering the very concept of international cooperation. It entirely transformed the conduct of global affairs. Many observers later look back at this era as a century of peace, noting that no total European war erupted until the global cataclysm of 1914. This experiment in a rules-based order acted as a primitive precursor to the United Nations, proving that the masses of the world could prefer this conference table to the gore-spattered battlefield. However, this stability was a stultified orthodoxy bought at an immense human cost. The clinical disregard of the will of the people turned the continent into a pressure cooker, inevitably triggering the violent explosions of 1830 and 1848. Furthermore, by building an order based on the rights of the strongest, the settlement planted the bitter seeds of 1914. The unresolved tensions and aggressive nationalism fostered by this artificial structure linked the ballroom walls of Vienna directly to the horrific cataclysms of the 20th century. Ultimately, the reconstruction of Europe was a carnival of monarchs, where the weak had no resource beyond intrigue. While the kings successfully reasserted their right to rule, they failed to satisfy the fundamental needs of the nations they governed. The great men left Vienna with the conviction that they had saved the world, after simply arresting the march of history for a season. In the cold light of reality, the conquest served as a triumph for the powerful, while remaining a profound failure for the cause of justice.